This Friday marks the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington. The march in 1963 stemmed from a growing tide of outrage over the nation's racial inequalities. The rally drew over 260,000 people and was, of course, highlighted by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Among the goals of the march was equal access to the polls. All these years later, voting rights remain a major concern. Jason Miles explains and kicks off our special series, March On.
Problems at the polls seem as inevitable as hot Texas summers. Remember this line at a Houston voting location earlier this year? But waiting in a long line to vote wasn't even an option for many minorities until the March on Washington and other events prompted sweeping change.
I'm sure that many things will happen as a result of the march.
Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. watched 2 years later as President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory practices like poll taxes and literacy tests as prerequisites to voting.
And I would put the March on Washington pretty high on the list of important events that form the prehistory of what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, without question.
Former UT history professor Mark Lawrence is the current director of the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, which has an extensive collection of materials related to the passage of the landmark voting legislation.
Still, though, I think there were significant barriers connected not so much to legal factors, of course, after the adoption of the Voting Rights Act, as to just everyday social pressures, cultural norms that inhibited people from voting.
Some say many hurdles remain when it comes to equal access to the polls.
The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act made huge advancements, but we still face a lot of challenges today. Voter suppression today.
Nonpartisan Common Cause Texas cites things like polling place closures, voting roll purges, ID requirements, and antiquated machinery. Not to mention the more timely topic of vote by mail, which Texas has yet to significantly expand.
Really doesn't make any sense during normal times, but in particular during this pandemic, people should not have to go to a poll site in person.
He and others hope everyone can vote free from confusion, suppression, or intimidation this November. Aspirations that seem to exist no matter the decade. In Houston, Jason Miles, KHOU 11 News.